A lot of people have a bottle of rooting hormone gel in a drawer somewhere, or a fungicide spray under the sink, something bought specifically to keep a sick plant alive. That seems normal. But what's actually in most of those products, and what people used before they existed, is rarely talked about. And once you notice the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere in how we treat plants at home. Because this connects to something much bigger than gardening. And this is where the real problem begins. Most people think a sick plant needs a store product. Root rot means a fungicide. A struggling cutting means a rooting hormone. Fungus gnats mean a pesticide. Ants near a pot mean an ant bait or a spray. This isn't a strange assumption. It's what garden centers are built around. Aisle after aisle of specific solutions for specific plant problems, each one in its own bottle, each one implying that without it, the plant doesn't stand much of a chance. This is seen as normal because it's the only version most people have ever been shown. Somebody starts keeping houseplants, a leaf turns yellow, or a stem goes soft, and the instinct is to search for a product, not a method. That instinct isn't foolish, it's just incomplete. Because for most of the time people have grown things indoors and outdoors, there was no aisle to walk down. There was only what was already in the kitchen. Think about how that search actually plays out for most people. A leaf turns yellow, a stem softens, and the first move is opening a phone and typing the symptom into a search bar. What comes back is almost always a product recommendation, ranked, reviewed, and one click away from being ordered. That's not a coincidence either. It's the natural outcome of an information ecosystem that's mostly funded by the same companies making the products being recommended. None of that makes the advice wrong. It just means the range of solutions being surfaced is narrower than the range that actually exists. Cinnamon is one of those things. Not as a folk superstition, but as something with real, documented antifungal behavior. The compound responsible is called cinnamaldehyde, and it's the same compound that gives cinnamon its smell and taste. It also happens to interfere with the growth of several common fungal pathogens, the kind responsible for damping off in seedlings, for certain rot conditions, for mold that shows up on the surface of overwatered soil. This isn't a fringe claim. It's shown up in horticultural research and has been used long before it was studied, by growers who noticed it worked without needing to know why. It helps to understand roughly how it works, because that's usually where the skepticism disappears. Cinnamaldehyde interferes with the way certain fungal cells function, making it harder for them to establish and spread. It's the same basic property that made cinnamon valuable as a food preservative long before refrigeration existed, added to stored grains and preserved meats, not for flavor alone, but because it slowed the exact kind of microbial growth that spoils food. The plant version of this is the same chemistry, applied to soil and stems instead of a pantry. That continuity is worth sitting with for a second. The same jar, doing a version of the same job it's always done, just in a different room of the house. Here's what's actually happening when a plant gets sick indoors. Almost every common houseplant problem traces back to one of a small handful of causes: fungal infection at the roots or stem, fungal or bacterial infection at a fresh wound, like a cut or a broken branch, an insect problem that's being fed by conditions in the soil, or simple stress from too much water sitting somewhere it shouldn't be. None of these are exotic. They're the same handful of problems every grower has dealt with for as long as people have kept plants close to where they live. What's usually overlooked is how few actual root causes are hiding behind a shelf full of differently labeled products. A rooting gel, a fungicide spray, an ant bait, and a gnat treatment can look like 4 unrelated purchases. Underneath, at least 3 of them are addressing the same basic vulnerability: an open wound or a damp surface that a fungus or bacteria can exploit. 4 bottles for one underlying weakness isn't a coincidence. It's what a shelf full of specialized products looks like once you stop assuming each one represents a distinct problem. What changed isn't the plant. What changed is what people reach for first. Before commercial plant care really existed as an industry, before there were labeled products for every individual symptom, home growers relied on a small set of tools that did several jobs at once. Cinnamon was one of them, and it wasn't used because it was trendy. It was used because it was already there, it was cheap, and it worked well enough that it got passed down. A pinch on a fresh cutting to keep it from rotting before it could root. A light dusting on the surface of seed trays to stop the fungus that kills young seedlings almost overnight. A line around the base of a pot to disrupt the ants that were farming aphids on the leaves above. These weren't separate discoveries. They were one ingredient, understood well enough to be used in several different ways, by people who didn't need a different product for every problem. So why did that change? Why did a spice get replaced by a shelf of specialized products? Part of it is genuinely useful. Modern fungicides and rooting compounds are engineered to be more concentrated, more consistent, and in some cases, more effective at treating an infection that's already advanced. That's real, and it's worth saying plainly, because this isn't about dismissing modern gardening products as unnecessary across the board. But usefulness isn't the only force at work here. A large part of what shaped the modern gardening aisle is the same thing that shaped most consumer product categories over the last several decades. Specialization sells better than a single flexible ingredient. A product with one narrow use case, packaged distinctly, marketed for one specific symptom, is easier to sell as essential than an ingredient that quietly does 5 things and costs almost nothing. Convenience matters too. A pre-mixed spray with instructions on the bottle removes the need to know anything about why it works, and shelf stability plays a role most people never think about. A commercial product is designed to sit in a warehouse and a store shelf for months without changing. Something as simple as a jar of cinnamon doesn't need any of that infrastructure, which also means there's very little industry incentive behind reminding people it works. There's also a scale problem underneath all of this that has nothing to do with any single company being deceptive. Mass production rewards consistency, and consistency is much easier to achieve with a synthesized, standardized compound manufactured under controlled conditions than with a natural ingredient whose potency can vary batch to batch depending on where and how it was grown. That's not a criticism of cinnamon. It's just a description of why an industry built around scale and predictability naturally gravitates toward lab-formulated alternatives, even when a simpler ingredient does a comparable job for the average home grower who isn't managing thousands of acres. There's a cost dimension here too, and it's worth being specific about it rather than vague. A small bottle of rooting hormone, a fungicide spray, and an ant bait can easily run $30 to $50 combined once you've bought all 3. A jar of ground cinnamon costs a few dollars and handles versions of all 3 jobs. That gap isn't dramatic on its own, but multiplied across the number of households buying a new bottle every season instead of reaching for something already in the cabinet, it adds up to a meaningful amount of unnecessary spending on problems that a $5 spice has been handling for a very long time. This is usually the part that gets overlooked. Not that companies did something secretive, just that an entire category of everyday knowledge quietly stopped getting passed down, because there was no longer a reason for anyone to repeat it. Nobody needed to tell you cinnamon stops fungal spread if there was a product on the shelf already doing that job, with a label, a barcode, and a reason to buy it again next season. And this is the part most people miss entirely. It isn't that the old method got proven wrong and replaced by something better. In many cases, it just stopped being mentioned, which, over enough time, starts to look identical to being disproven, even though nothing was ever actually tested against it. And here's the part that actually matters, the long-term effect of that shift. It isn't dramatic. Nobody's plants are dying because cinnamon disappeared from gardening advice. What's been lost is smaller and slower than that, which is exactly why it goes unnoticed. It's the erosion of a certain kind of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you can solve a problem with what's already in your house, instead of needing to identify the correct product, order it, wait for it, and hope it was the right one. That confidence used to be ordinary. Now it feels like a trick, something surprising, when really it's just older than the alternative. There's a quieter cost too, one that's easy to miss because it doesn't show up in any single moment. Every specialized product bought for a problem that a pantry staple could have solved is also a product that eventually gets thrown away half-used, a bottle that expires before it's finished, a plastic container that didn't need to exist for a job that a spice jar you already owned could have done. None of that is a crisis on its own. But it's part of the same pattern. Small inefficiencies stacking quietly because the simpler option stopped being anyone's first thought. This connects to something deeper than plant care. It's the same pattern that shows up whenever a simple, flexible, low-cost method gets quietly replaced by something specialized and repurchased. It happened with food preservation, where a handful of traditional techniques, salting, fermenting, drying, got replaced by refrigeration and packaged preservatives, some of which are genuinely better, and some of which just made a traditional skill feel unnecessary to learn. It happened with basic home first aid too. A generation that grew up watching a parent clean a wound with something already in the kitchen has largely been replaced by a generation reaching for a purpose-built product first, not because the older method stopped working, but because it stopped being the default anyone modeled. The plant version of this story is smaller in stakes than either of those, but it's the same shape. A useful, low-cost, multi-purpose method didn't get disproven. It just stopped being repeated, until it started sounding unfamiliar to the exact people who could have benefited from it most. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last. Whenever a category of home knowledge gets replaced by a category of home products, something small gets lost in the transition, even when the replacement genuinely works well. The instinct to reach for something already in the house, understand roughly why it works, and use it with a little bit of judgment, that instinct doesn't disappear because it stopped being useful. It disappears because nobody had a reason to keep repeating it out loud. This connects directly to a much broader shift in how people relate to the things around their own homes, not just plants. The further removed something becomes from a labeled product with instructions on it, the less confident most people feel using it, even when the underlying method is simpler and older than the product that replaced it. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really anyone's fault. It's what happens naturally, when convenience scales faster than knowledge does. Now here's where this becomes something you can actually use tonight, because awareness without application isn't worth much. If you have a seedling tray, and you're worried about damping off, that sudden collapse right at the soil line that wipes out young seedlings almost overnight, a very light dusting of ground cinnamon across the surface of the soil creates a barrier that fungal spores have a harder time crossing. Not a thick layer, a thin one. Too much traps moisture against delicate stems and can cause the exact problem you're trying to prevent. If you're taking a cutting from an existing plant, whether for propagation or because you had to cut away damaged growth, dip the fresh cut end into cinnamon before setting it in soil or water. This does the same job as a commercial wound sealant, forming a light protective layer over exposed plant tissue while it heals. Tap off the excess before you use it. A clump does nothing but sit there. This one matters more than it might seem, because a fresh cut is genuinely the most vulnerable moment in a plant's life. It's an open door, structurally not so different from a wound on skin, and it stays open until the plant manages to callus over on its own. Everything that happens in that window, whether the cutting survives long enough to root or rots before it gets the chance, depends on what's protecting that exposed tissue in the meantime. If a plant has root rot, and you catch it early enough that some of the roots are still healthy, rinse the roots clean, trim away anything soft or discolored with clean scissors, and lightly dust what remains with cinnamon before repotting into fresh, dry soil. Let the roots air dry for roughly an hour first. Sealing wet, cinnamon-coated roots directly into damp soil undermines the entire point. Root rot is worth pausing on, because it's usually the most misunderstood problem on this list. By the time the leaves show visible stress, yellowing, wilting despite moist soil, a general look of decline, the roots have often been compromised for weeks already. What people see is a sick-looking plant. What's actually happening is a slow collapse underground that's simply invisible until it isn't. That gap between when the damage starts and when it becomes visible is exactly why so many houseplants get thrown away as unsalvageable when a portion of the root system was still recoverable. If fungus gnats have shown up, and they usually mean the top layer of soil has stayed wet longer than it should have, a light surface dusting of cinnamon disrupts the fungal layer their larvae actually feed on. It's slower than a chemical spray, but it addresses where the problem is actually coming from instead of just catching the adults flying around afterward. It needs to be reapplied after watering, since that's what washes the surface layer away. Most people treat gnats as the problem itself, buying sticky traps or sprays aimed at the adult insects circling above the soil. That's treating a symptom while ignoring where it's actually coming from. The adults are a visible nuisance. The larvae, invisible in the top inch of soil, are the ones doing the damage to root hairs, and the ones actually sustaining the infestation generation after generation. A trap catches what's already flying. Disrupting the surface layer stops the next generation from ever hatching. If ants have started showing up near a plant, they're very often not interested in the plant itself. They're farming aphids, protecting them in exchange for the sweet residue the aphids produce. Ants navigate using scent trails, and they tend to avoid crossing a line of cinnamon. A border around the base of an affected pot, refreshed after rain or heavy watering, can cut off that relationship without a single spray. This is worth noticing because it's a good example of solving a problem one step removed from where it appears. The ants aren't really the issue, the aphids are. And the aphids are only sustained because the ants are actively protecting them from natural predators. Break one link in that chain, and the whole arrangement tends to fall apart on its own, without needing to treat the ants and the aphids as two separate problems, requiring two separate products. And if something is actively spreading right now, visible mold across the soil surface, a soft spot climbing up a stem, fungal patches multiplying faster than you can keep up with, a thin paste of cinnamon, mixed with a small amount of water, applied directly to the affected area, slows the spread on contact. It isn't a permanent fix by itself. It's the pause button. While it works, the real fix is improving airflow around the plant, moving it away from anything crowding it, cracking a window, running a small fan nearby. The paste buys time. Airflow prevents the return. And if you're storing bulbs, tubers, or seeds over winter, the kind of self-sufficiency task that's quietly disappeared from most households, along with everything else in this pattern, a light dusting of cinnamon in the storage container does the same protective job it does in soil. Bulbs and tubers stored in a box or paper bag are just as vulnerable to fungal rot as anything sitting in a pot, and a pinch of cinnamon mixed through dry storage material, sand, sawdust, or even just newspaper keeps that rot from establishing before spring. It's the same compound, the same mechanism, applied to something dormant instead of something actively growing. None of these are extreme changes. Nobody's being asked to throw out a fungicide they already own or swear off modern gardening products altogether. This is simpler than that. It's just knowing there's a version of this that doesn't require a trip to the store, doesn't require a new bottle for every symptom, and has been quietly working for longer than most of the products that eventually replaced it. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last. Whenever a category of home knowledge gets replaced by a category of home products, something small gets lost in the transition, even when the replacement genuinely works well. The instinct to reach for something already in the house, understand roughly why it works, and use it with a little bit of judgment, that instinct doesn't disappear because it stopped being useful. It disappears because nobody had a reason to keep repeating it out loud. This connects directly to a much broader shift in how people relate to the things around their own homes, not just plants. The further removed something becomes from a labeled product with instructions on it, the less confident most people feel using it, even when the underlying method is simpler and older than the product that replaced it. That's not a coincidence. And it's not really anyone's fault. It's what happens naturally when convenience scales faster than knowledge does. What happens next with any individual plant depends less on which product sits under your sink, and more on whether you understand what's actually going wrong with it in the first place. A fungicide can slow an infection. It can't tell you why the infection started, and it won't stop you from ending up right back where you started next season if the underlying cause, usually something as simple as overwatering, or poor airflow, or a wound left unprotected, never gets addressed. That's really the difference between managing a symptom and understanding a plant. One requires a receipt, the other requires paying attention, and paying attention has always been the cheaper option, even when it doesn't feel like it in the moment you're standing in the garden aisle trying to decide which bottle to buy. This is part of a series looking at everyday things a little differently, the small habits and defaults that quietly replaced something older, and what actually changes once you notice it. Plant care is one of the smaller, lower-stakes versions of this pattern. But once you start noticing how often a simple, flexible, low-cost method got replaced by something specialized and repurchased, it becomes hard to unsee the same shape showing up in the kitchen, in the medicine cabinet, in almost every corner of a modern home. And the next one is even harder to ignore once you understand this.